The Second World War did not erupt suddenly. It grew slowly from the fractures left by the First World War and from the ambitions of nations that believed they deserved more than what the world had allotted them. In the 1920s, 6 major powers dominated the global stage, but 2 were unmatched in wealth, reach, and influence: Britain and the United States. Britain presided over the largest empire in human history, its navy ruling the world's oceans with an authority no other nation could challenge. Across the Atlantic, the United States thrived as the world's financial center, its industry the envy of the world. These powers, if united, could shape the fate of continents. But when the global economy collapsed in 1929, everything changed. The Great Depression shook the foundations of society everywhere. Millions were thrown into poverty, political systems faltered, and desperate populations turned to leaders who promised revival at any cost. In Japan and Germany, nationalism hardened into an ideology of expansion, of empire, and of racial destiny. Their new governments did not see war as disaster, they saw it as opportunity. They believed that resources, land, and power were to be seized, not negotiated for, and that only through conquest could they rise as global superpowers. While these ambitions took shape, Britain, France, and the United States chose the opposite path. Scarred by the memory of the First World War, they resolved to avoid another conflict at all costs. Britain and France tried to steady Europe through diplomacy and concessions. The United States passed strict neutrality laws, retreating behind its oceans. Across Europe, leaders hoped that, if they made enough compromises, the drums of war might be silenced. It was a comforting hope, until the world proved it false. Japan moved first. In 1931, it invaded Manchuria, beginning a campaign of expansion across East Asia. By 1937, it had plunged into full-scale war with China, conquering cities with terrifying speed. But China was vast, and resistance was fierce. As Japanese soldiers advanced, they committed horrific atrocities, believing themselves racially superior to the people they conquered. Entire regions were left in ruins, and by war's end, as many as 20 million Chinese civilians would be dead. Yet even as they murdered and expanded, Japan found itself stretched thin, unable to subdue the entire Chinese continent. Meanwhile, in Europe, Germany moved step by step toward domination. First the Rhineland in 1936, then Austria in 1938, then the Sudetenland later that year. Each conquest justified with claims of protecting ethnic Germans. To avoid war, Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain met Adolf Hitler in Munich, signing a declaration that promised peace. Chamberlain famously believed that this agreement had secured peace for our time. He returned home relieved, certain he had stopped Europe from sliding into another catastrophe. He was wrong. In March 1939, Hitler seized the rest of Czechoslovakia, proving that his ambitions were far greater than he had admitted. Britain and France, realizing diplomacy had failed, guaranteed the independence of Poland. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, the Second World War began. And in a shocking twist, the Soviet Union, ideological enemy of Nazism, invaded Poland from the east. For a brief moment, the two totalitarian powers cooperated, carving Europe into spheres of influence. The Soviets absorbed the Baltic states, parts of Romania, and fought a vicious war with Finland. Germany struck west, conquering Denmark and Norway in rapid succession before turning toward France. In 1940, the world watched in disbelief as German forces launched a campaign unlike anything seen before. Using fast-moving armor, mechanized infantry, and overwhelming air support, they crushed the armies of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands in just 6 weeks. It was a stunning victory. Britain evacuated hundreds of thousands of soldiers from Dunkirk, but left behind nearly all heavy equipment. The Luftwaffe roared overhead. Europe seemed lost. Germany appeared unstoppable. Yet Britain fought on. Churchill refused to surrender, insisting that the empire would stand firm even if alone. Britain had the English Channel as a natural barrier, the world's most powerful navy, and a cutting-edge air defense network. In the Battle of Britain, the Royal Air Force, using advanced radar and skilled pilots, held back the Luftwaffe. Britain survived, and the war entered a new phase. At this moment, the Axis looked strong, but beneath the surface, their alliances were already cracking. Italy tried to build an empire in North Africa and the Balkans, but suffered humiliating defeats. Germany's vast new territory was blockaded by the Royal Navy, creating shortages of food, oil, and raw materials. Japan's occupation of French Indochina provoked fury in the United States, which imposed an oil and steel embargo. Overnight, Japan lost 94% of its oil imports. Its war machine was running out of fuel. And although America was not yet in the war, it provided vital supplies to Britain through the Lend-Lease Act, flooding Europe with American-made tanks, aircraft, and food. For the Axis, the window of opportunity was closing. Cornered, Germany and Japan made desperate moves. Germany feared becoming dependent on the Soviet Union. Japan feared economic collapse. In 1941, both expanded the war. In June, Germany launched the largest invasion force in history against the Soviet Union. Hitler believed that Soviet resistance would crumble quickly. He viewed Slavic people as racially inferior and unfit to challenge German might. He famously claimed that the Soviet Union was a rotten edifice that would fall with a single powerful strike. He was catastrophically wrong. The Soviet Union was vast, and its people were prepared to sacrifice everything. Entire factories were dismantled piece by piece and transported across the Ural Mountains so they would remain safe from German attack. There, they were rebuilt and began producing weapons day and night. Millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians rallied to defend their homeland. Cities like Leningrad endured starvation sieges. Villages were burned. Families were torn apart. Yet the Soviets did not collapse. They fought with staggering resilience. 25 million Soviet citizens would die before the war was over. The Germans advanced rapidly in the summer, but the deeper they pushed into Soviet territory, the more overstretched they became. Supply lines thinned, winter approached, and Soviet counterattacks stiffened. In December 1941, within sight of Moscow, the German advance finally halted. The gamble had failed. What was supposed to be a lightning victory had turned into a brutal war of attrition that Germany could not afford. And as German forces stalled in the freezing snow, the world changed again. Japan, desperate for resources, struck the United States at Pearl Harbor, pulling America fully into the war. The conflict was now global. Factories from Detroit to Glasgow began producing weapons at a rate the Axis could never match. The balance of power shifted. What had begun as a war of rapid conquests became a struggle of endurance, and the Axis, divided in strategy and overwhelmed by industrial giants, had overreached. This was the beginning of their downfall at almost the same moment Germany was being halted outside Moscow. A second storm was forming on the other side of the world. Japan, still locked in a brutal and exhausting war across China, was running out of the resources needed to keep its empire alive. Its leaders looked south, to the oil fields, rubber plantations, and mineral-rich lands of Southeast Asia, and believed that seizing these territories was the only path to survival. But they also knew such a move would almost certainly bring the United States into the war. And so, to shield their advance across the Pacific, Japan made a calculated choice that would transform the course of global history. They launched a sudden, devastating attack on the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The strike was swift and brutal. Battleships burned, aircraft were destroyed on the ground, and the United States found itself dragged instantly into the conflict Japan hoped to delay. But from Japan's perspective, the gamble worked, at least at first. With the U.S. fleet crippled, Japanese forces surged forward, capturing the resources they desperately needed. Their plan was simple: fortify their new empire so fiercely that the Americans, whom Japanese commanders believed lacked the courage for a long war, would negotiate rather than fight. Instead, the opposite happened. The attack on Pearl Harbor stunned the American public, erasing years of isolationism in a matter of hours. Within days, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union had aligned with a single shared objective: nothing short of the complete, unconditional defeat of the Axis powers. This decision transformed the war. The Allies resolved to use their unmatched access to manpower, industry, and natural resources to wage a grinding campaign on land, in the air, and at sea. Massive American factories, including the enormous Willow Run plant in Michigan, began producing war machines at a pace the world had never seen. So quickly that at the height of production, a new B-24 Liberator bomber rolled out every 63 minutes. The tide of material strength was beginning to shift, and soon the momentum of the war would shift with it. By 1942, Allied codebreakers had cracked both German and Japanese communications, giving commanders insight into enemy plans. This intelligence played a decisive role in turning the Pacific War. At Midway, American carriers launched a daring assault that sank 4 of Japan's frontline aircraft carriers, the core of its naval striking power. From that moment on, Japan would never regain the initiative at sea. On the Eastern Front, the struggle was even more ferocious. Germany's desperate push to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus stumbled into the ruined streets of Stalingrad. There, in the bloodiest battle of the war, Soviet forces surrounded and annihilated an entire German army. What Hitler had hoped would be a lightning-fast campaign turned into a grinding war of attrition he could not win. Germany and Japan had gambled on rapid victories. Instead, they found themselves trapped in conflicts where the Allies possessed overwhelming numerical, industrial, and logistical superiority. At sea, the Battle of the Atlantic raged from the first day of the war to the last. Germany's U-boats prowled the waters, sinking millions of tons of Allied shipping in an attempt to starve Britain into submission. During the height of what German submariners called the Second Happy Time, Allied losses were devastating. But the tide slowly turned. The Allies built Liberty ships at astonishing speed, 3 every 2 days, replacing losses almost as fast as they occurred. Convoy tactics improved, new long-range aircraft closed the deadly mid-ocean gap, and advanced tools such as sonar and the Hedgehog mortar gave escort ships the ability to hunt and destroy their underwater enemy. By 1943, the U-boat threat was being crushed, and the noose around the Axis tightened. Japan faced a similar disaster at sea. As American submarines attacked Japanese shipping lanes, vital resources never reached the home islands. Oil shortages became so severe that Japanese pilots trained only minimally before being thrown into combat, where better-prepared Allied aviators easily shot them down. Allied success in the air was equally decisive. With Italy collapsing and the Soviets pushing westward, the Allies gained closer access to Axis territory. American and British bombers launched a relentless, around-the-clock campaign over Germany. Americans striking factories in daylight while the RAF pounded cities night after night. The cost was enormous for the air crews, but the impact was devastating. German aircraft production was forced to scatter into countless small factories, losing efficiency. Every time Luftwaffe fighters rose to intercept the bomber streams, they were met by swarms of Allied escort fighters who inflicted increasingly heavy losses. By 1944, Germany's air defenses were collapsing. In Asia, American bombers began unleashing firebombing raids across Japanese cities, burning entire districts to ash. The loss of life was catastrophic, and the scale of devastation signaled Japan's collapsing ability to withstand the onslaught. Meanwhile, on the ground, the war revealed its darkest horrors. In 1944, as Allied forces advanced across Europe, they uncovered the reality of the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children. It was a crime perpetrated in the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe, driven by hatred and sustained by the machinery of the German state. On the Western Front, Allied troops stormed ashore in France on D-Day, opening the long-awaited Second Front. At the same time, the Soviets launched Operation Bagration, a massive offensive that destroyed Germany's Army Group Center and shattered the Eastern Front. Allied forces possessed superior logistics, better supplies, and an understanding of modern armored warfare that Germany, weakened by Hitler's increasingly erratic decisions, could not match. Leadership became a decisive factor. Early in the war, German commanders had enjoyed significant autonomy, which helped them achieve stunning victories. But as the war dragged on, Hitler tightened his grip, refusing to allow strategic retreats and insisting on hopeless last stands. Stalin, once distrustful and rigid, slowly learned to trust his generals, improving Soviet coordination and strategic planning. In contrast, Hitler's delusions grew. He believed Germany's so-called vengeance weapons, like the V-1 flying bomb, would terrorize Allied cities into surrender. Instead, these weapons drained Germany's dwindling resources and cost countless lives of forced laborers who built them in underground factories. By 1945, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Germany was collapsing from both east and west. Yet both Germany and Japan chose to fight on. In the Pacific, this resolve took the form of kamikaze attacks. Young pilots ordered to crash their explosive-laden planes into Allied ships, sacrificing themselves in a desperate attempt to halt the inevitable. Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, crushed beneath the Allied advance. Japan continued the struggle until August, when the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Soviet forces invaded Manchuria. At last, Japan recognized that further resistance was hopeless. The Second World War ended with the Allies victorious. Their triumph was not simply the result of greater resources, though those were decisive. It was also the product of endurance, strategy, innovation, and the determination of millions who fought, labored, and sacrificed. They overcame early disasters, adjusted their tactics, and marshaled the immense strength of their societies. When victory finally arrived, Churchill stood before cheering crowds on VE Day and declared, "This is your victory." It belonged not to any single leader, but to the countless men and women whose resilience, courage, and suffering shaped the course of history and brought the most destructive war the world had ever known to its end.